when you say, what do you want to tell young women? I don't want to tell them that it's a wonderful, exciting, engaging period to fight for women's rights. What I want to say is it's essential to fight for women's rights because nobody's going to give it to you. And even if you think you've got everything you need, you better keep your eyes open because it can be taken away. And it can be taken away like that.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Linda Silver Dranoff, lawyer, writer, activist. As a practicing lawyer, Linda helped individuals seek justice from the legal system. As a writer, she made the law accessible and empowered women through her 25-year Ask a Lawyer column in Chatelaine Magazine, also by authoring Women in Canadian Law, A History, Every Woman's Guide to the Law, and 4 editions of Every Canadian's Guide to the Law. Fairly Equal, Lawyering the Feminist Revolution is her memoir of her life in the law and a social history of the women's movement. Linda was active in speaking and lobbying for change in the issues important to women, such as childcare, pay equity, employment equity, CPP pension rights, charter rights, and sexual harassment. Her significant achievement was in family law reform. Linda led the campaign resulting in Ontario's Family Law Act 1986, which provided for equal sharing of property accumulated by husband and wife during marriage. She also lobbied successfully for an automatic cost of living adjustment and support payments, the rights of widowed persons to share property, the same as those who are divorced, government enforcement of support orders and agreements, and more. Linda led the way for women lawyers. She was the founding chair of the Feminist Legal Analysis section of the Ontario Bar Association, now called the Women's Lawyer Forum, where women lawyers meet to collaborate on systemic legal problems. Linda has been recognized and honored for her legal work and activist achievements by the legal profession, the women's community, and beyond. Among other honors, she was awarded the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case, the Order of Ontario, and the Order of Canada.
Today, this episode, we're talking to Linda Silver Dranoff, lawyer, writer, activist, also a columnist with Chatelaine Magazine, Ask a Lawyer. So we're going to ask a lawyer. Let's start with just some of the basics. You describe yourself as having that typical 1950s, 1960s upbringing. Tell us more. Tell us what influenced you, your role models. Why law?
Well, there really were no role models for what a woman could be or do in the 1950s. And I have to admit that it's the 1950s that I grew up and went to high school and then to university. Thankfully, fortunately, remarkably, because women didn't go to university very often in those days. But role model, I realized much later that there wasn't any because there were no women lawyers that I knew. I didn't think women were lawyers. They weren't in the society as lawyers. So when I first went through university and was deciding what to do after I got my BA, law was something that was a no-no. It was on my secret list, but not something that I could do. Listen, in the 50s, as it had been for centuries before, women were expected to fulfill a role in the family, period. You find yourself a good husband who hopefully could afford to keep you in nice things and with whom you could raise a family, and that was a woman's life. And if she was really good at it, her husband benefited and her children benefited. But women working was not part of that era. In I think it was like in 1941 there was less than 10% of married women were in the workforce. I mean, women didn't work. But then when you say what were my influences, my mother. I don't come from a wealthy family. My mother was a crackerjack typist in an era when it was the Remington.
Yes.
No, those old typewriters where if you did 55 words a minute, you were pretty good. She did 115. 115 words a
Not
minute.
an electric, a manual
Not
typewriter.
an electric.
A manual typewriter. Wow.
Before electric. Before electric. And she did 115 words a minute. So she earned more than my father at that time because she was so good at that. And they always paid women on salary. But she produced so much that she talked her bosses into paying her by the piece. In those days, you typed the envelopes, who the letter was to. You typed every letter manually. You typed every envelope manually. And so she said, give me so much per envelope, so much per letter. Whatever that adds up to, that'll be fine. So she ended up making $25 a week at a time when my father could only earn $9. Because she got it by the piece. So I had that example of entrepreneurial smarts, And again, she had a job. She was married. She didn't tell them because they would have made her leave. I mean, she told me these stories, And but when she got pregnant 4 years later with my older brother, she decided that she wasn't just going to leave the job, tell them she's leaving. How could she tell them she's having a child if they didn't know she was even married in those days? So what she said was, she has an illness. She didn't want to explain what it was. And what she would like to do is have her sister fill in for her while she was away. And she would be on the phone with her. She would train her. Right? So that's what happened. So she left. She says, the only thing I lost was a gift, a goodbye gift, right? And her sister had that job for the rest of her working life.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
This was the 30s. Anyway, I won't go, but so that I have the example of that kind of mother.
Those stories are important to hear.
Yeah, well, I have the example of that kind of a mother who was resourceful. And I have the example of a father who, even though he had to leave school to work after grade 8, went to night school and got his high school education that way. But he was very much somebody who talked about social activism and social justice. So I heard that around me without really getting it as a lecture or a lesson. It was just part of, I saw it in action in my life. In that era, in the late 40s, 50s, the Japanese had been interred because they were Canadian Japanese, because they had been perceived as being part of the war, because Japan as a state was in the Second World War. And many of them were interred. And after the war, they couldn't find places to live. Well, my parents weren't having any of that. They were renting out a room or 2 rooms in the house that we had. And they rented to this lovely young couple who lived with us for I don't know how long, because they couldn't find anywhere else to live. They worked, they earned money. They could have, they could have afforded, but they couldn't find a place to live. So I guess just in summary, I have that kind of family background of which I'm proud. And I think, that sits in your, it sits inside you.
So when was that aha moment when you started to get involved in the women's movement or be interested in, a lot of the women's issues that, you've now spent a lifetime working on? Was it at university?
It was at university. Until then, I just looked upon it as fairness. There was no women's movement. There was no women's rights. The word feminism was not known to me, if to anybody else. Um, but when I managed to persuade my parents to let me go to university, which was a thing, a thing in itself at that time, I participated in a lot of the activities because wonderful way to learn too. But the first year I got there, I heard that John F. Kennedy, who was then a senator, was going to be debating at Hart House, and he was as a guest speaker.
Wow.
And he was the student speaker who he would be up against was Stephen Lewis. At that time, I mean, a preeminent speaker. I mean, brilliant. He's always been a brilliant speaker from way back then. So a group of us said, well, we'd like to participate. We'd like to attend, right? And the rule at Hart House at that time, it was founded by the Hart Massey family, in his honor, was men only. Men only. Now, I'd never come across anything like this before, that something was men only. And but they had, over the years, because it was founded in 1919, that they built this Hart House, which, for those who are listening who don't know what it is in Toronto, it was a place for companionship, for exercise activity, for debating. They had a music room, they had a library. It was like a community center for the university men.
So part of the University of Toronto.
Part of the University of Toronto, exactly.
Yeah.
So this debate we wanted to attend. They had already changed the rules slightly to say that women can come into a selected debate once a year. So we went to see the warden, the executive director of Hart House, to ask him to make this be the one. We were so ladylike. There, 3 of us went, and we asked so nicely, and we thought, well, how can he say no to us? Well, he did. No. We were not allowed, period. So we picketed, and a few other people joined us. We had maybe 20 out picketing in the rain outside Hart House. The debates room window was right up above where we were picketing and chanting fairness for women, equality for women. Now, we weren't knowingly starting anything. We weren't knowingly being feminists or being a women's room. It just wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair.
You didn't get to see the debate?
No. Not at all.
John Kennedy and Stephen Lewis,
yes.
And you couldn't get access.
That's right.
Because you're a girl.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
So that was my first sort of time I stood up in that kind of way for women's rights, because, as I say, it just wasn't fair. And of course, as life went on, I found lots of other reasons to understand why life wasn't fair for women.
I grew up thinking that I couldn't do things because I was young, not because I was a woman. It took me a long time to realize it was because I was a woman. I was always thought, I can't do this because I'm young. That's what I thought.
Well, that's part of the thing that women often, when they can't do something they want to do, they blame themselves, rather than blaming the systemic problem in society.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is so important for women of every age to understand. Yeah. Don't assume that because you're having difficulty in whatever the situation is, that it's because you did something wrong or you're mistaken. Consider that there's systemic bias going on.
Never occurred to me.
I know, and it doesn't occur to many women. Yeah. So what happens is the system in which women are discriminated against then includes women who are complicit, who go along and facilitate their unfair treatment.
Yeah. So you became a lawyer. You were still active in the movement, and by then in the 60s leading up to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, so you would have been understanding the Laura Sabia and all of her contributions to that part of the movement, so you're still getting involved at that time, I presume?
Well, I was called to the bar in 1974, and that was while I was in law school, I read the Royal Commission report on the status of women. It wasn't part of any course, but I got it. I thought, wow, wow, right? I read it cover to cover. I still have the copy in which I have, and flagging pages and underlining and
My copy signed by
notes.
Monique Bégin.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
she was a neighbor and a friend.
Wow.
Mm.
Well, I had occasion many years later to meet Florence Bird,
Oh, interesting.
and
Yes.
I should have thought to ask her to sign it. That would have been a good idea. And she was lovely. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
167
She
recommendations.
called me out of the blue. I didn't know her at all when my first book came out, to the Women in Canadian Law, to tell me what a wonderful book it was and how it really explained everything.
I
It was
do want
just
to.
a wonderful thing
I
to
want to
get
talk
that
about.
from the
I want to
blue.
talk about that because that's really. So when did you? So this is the Women in Canadian.
1977.
1977,
This was 3 years after I was called to the bar.
and you and I were talking last night, and you were telling me in the one chapter, you were covering the history of women in the law.
Yeah, yeah. It's called perspective. And I thought, well, how can you write about anything without sort of putting it in context? And that's my history background, right? So that's what it is, and it goes back to European roots from the beginning, 17th century. I mean, I go all the way through from early on, and very with pictures too. But this was used in the schools, and I was, and it was focused on the law. So we talked about Blackstone. Sir William Blackstone was who wrote an influential summary of women's legal status in English common law. Said a husband might give his wife moderate correction, just as he is allowed to correct his apprentices or children. And I pointed to that as the start of domestic violence.
Which was
That
never
kind
talked
of
about.
attitude.
Which was never talked about in the report on the
Royal Commission.
Never
That's
talked
the
about it.
big gap, and I don't know why.
I've talked about it with Monique, and it was because it was still considered a very private sphere issue.
Family.
And family. And she knew one of her colleagues was in a difficult relationship. And she said, we knew about it, but we couldn't say anything because it was the family. But you all also know that after that report was issued, a couple of years later, the women's shelters movement started. So,
Yes.
Abused women, domestic violence was, prevalent, and women had to leave. So the shelters movement started right after that.
Right.
But yeah, that was one of the reasons why there was no discussion of it. It was private.
Look at how those things come from a personal source. Wow.
Yeah, that's what she told me. Because I asked her that question.
By way of another example, I was arguing a case at the Court of Appeal years ago, and on family law, and the judge who was hearing the case was the lead on the case on the trial, the appeal. We lost, and badly. And I thought, all the evidence and all the facts were there. And I learned later he was in the middle of a divorce that nobody knew about. And you just knew that it had a bearing. Even in the questions he asked, I thought, there's something going on here that I don't know about. So it shows you how
personal bias.
How personal bias it comes in sometimes, hopefully not too often. But
yeah. So tell me more about this book, because it was well received, and it was used in schools, and it was
Yes.
really about all the parts of a woman's life that intersects with the law at some point.
That's right, because I started with and this was three years after I opened my own office for the practice of law. I got a call. There was a suggestion that they were looking for this as part of a series. So it's perspective, the single woman as wife. This is the history of women's legal status as wife, as mother, property matters, separation and divorce, women in the economy, women as citizens, and conclusion. And if I'm right, because in every book I've written, I've talked about sisterhood and how women have to stick together.
But a lot's changed since then.
Sure. Well, a lot of those things relate to women in the family. Our role over 2,000 years has been women in the family. And the only rights women had through human history was to produce children, to be supported by a husband in the manner in which he chose to support her. And that was it. And if there was a a separation or anything like that, which didn't happen. It happened more informally than because formalities were not available. If there was a separation, the woman could be deprived of custody of her children, of her right to see them. She could get, a few bucks, maybe. And there was very little enforcement of it. If she couldn't even own property until the about 1860s, the Married Women's Property Acts were finally, in the 1860s, that's 150 years ago, the Married Women's Property Acts were legislated in Britain and in the common law countries. And so she started to be able to own property as a single person. If she was married, it became her husband's property.
I want to take you up to the 1975 or 1972 case, Iris Murdoch, because that was a big change, talking about property and maintenance. That was a big case. I actually remember it. I actually remember it.
It was like the one that shocked everybody, because by 1970, I graduated 72 and I studied in law school. So it was 70, 71 in there. And for family law, and I remember, you talk about consciousness raising. I remember reading that case in family law, of course, and thinking, how is this possible? This was a farm wife married to Mr. Murdoch, who worked alongside him on the farm, just the same as he did. They were equal in everything, in terms of work, in terms of responsibility. But then he was, I believe, he was abusive toward her, but in any event, they separated. And so she brought a court case, and what they ordered was that she receive $200, if I remember correctly, $200 a month in support, period, and the farm was his. So this was, the farm wife who, there'd been another case around that time too called Rathwell that also got some interest, but Murdoch really.
This was huge.
It was huge, it was what encouraged for instance, the Ontario Law Reform Commission did a whole series of studies on family law that came out in 74, and I suspect that this case was one of those things, even though it was a case from out west, but it applied everywhere.
But it was also it was common law as opposed to the civil law, so
that's right.
So it would have applied.
That's right.
Canada.
So I think they started to study what we should do about family law, and for me, I was called to the bar in 1974 and set up my office, and suddenly we had the Ontario Law Reform Commission reporting on family law, suggesting huge changes, giving women a share of property, reviewing support issues, and all. It was this thick. But even there, I worked on, for the Ontario Committee on the Status of Women, which was a volunteer group. I was asked to participate with 3 other women lawyers, and there were not that many of us at the time, so we all knew each other, right? Mary Eberts, Rosie Abella, Jane Maddaw, who I don't know what became of her, but she was and me, and we summarized the Ontario Law Reform Commission report on family law into 12 pages so that we could distribute it, so that women could know what it was all about. And then the government, Karen Weiler was with the Ministry of the Attorney General at that point as a policy advisor. She became an appeal court judge later. And she got permission from us and from the Ontario Committee she distributed 50,000 copies of this 12-page summary around the province. And then everywhere any of us spoke, we gave these things out and so on. So we educated at the same time as we lobbied.
I find this all really interesting. It was a lot of work. You were also a practicing lawyer.
That's right.
And doing this on the side.
Oh, yeah.
And then doing the lobbying and the getting together and the discussions or the conferences and the meetings. So this would have been a great burden, or maybe not a burden.
I never thought of it as that.
It's probably a passion.
I really never saw that I had
it's not
a choice,
Yeah.
Because to me that, I guess I've always felt that way too. I was in a position at that point, I had developed the skills at that point to be able to do those things. And so I was supposed to do it. In other words, when you find, and I put that in my book as well, this Fairly Equal, that when you find yourself in a place where you can make a contribution in whatever way and at whatever level, you should do it. I mean, that's when you're. Not everybody could do, be the prime minister, for example, but you can do lots of things.
Yes. Yes.
Like
yes.
you're doing with this project on women's history.
Really
that's
excited.
So remarkable.
I'm really excited about this project, and I get to talk to some fabulous women. I want to know about any of the other cases, either that you worked on or that your other colleagues that worked on, that really made a difference in the precedent setting. So are there other examples that you can mention besides the Murdoch case, which is something I remember?
Yeah, I'll give it to you in a moment. Let me just go back to say that. So there was 1974, the Law Reform Commission report. We lobbied for change. In 1978, in Ontario, the Family Law Reform Act came in, and I believe it was the first one to make an effort to share property between husband and wife, to see marriage as a partnership, to provide for spousal support and things like that. Roy McMurtry was Attorney General under the Bill Davis Progressive Conservative government at the time, and this piece of legislation was brought in, and we thought, well, that's great. It wasn't what the Law Reform Commission had wanted, but it was a real advance. So, based on that, I mean, I was practicing lawyer. I had clients. I had a client named Mrs. Leatherdale, Barbara Leatherdale. And so I took a case to court. The trial judge, in conjunction with the 1978 Family Law Reform Act, I said, she worked outside the home. She was in the home and raised her child. They had a partnership, just as in the thing. She should get 50% of all the assets, right? And the trial judge said, I agree with you. Huh? And because they fought you on this, and the law seems to me very clear, the husband has to pay the wife's legal costs. So I thought, terrific. He appealed to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal didn't agree. And they even misread, in my view, the arguments that were made, but that's for another day. So we lost it in the Court of Appeal. And at that point, I thought, you know what? If it stops here, everything we've worked on to get family law equality for women is going to be out the window. It's gone because the law is being interpreted in a way that, in my view, makes no sense in terms of the goals of that legislation. So I took the case to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Oh, lovely.
It was the first case out of Ontario on family law at any time to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. I got leave to appeal. And there wasn't enough money involved, really. It was really the issue that was involved. And my client couldn't afford it. So I said to her, the only thing is, if I get an order for costs at the Supreme Court of Canada, right, then that'll pay for whatever it is, and hopefully the disbursements, right? But even on that, I mean, it was in Ottawa, we had to go from here to there. I mean, an important part of the history of the women's movement in Canada is Shirley Greenberg. And unfortunately, she's not still alive to be interviewed. But this is one story about her. She put me up, my junior lawyer, and my daughter, who came with us at that point. My daughter was 14 years old. Because when I went back to school, I had a child. That's another part of that. Oh, you must be busy. Issue. So she put us up. She arranged for the courtroom during the argument to be filled with all the Ottawa women lawyers she knew in support. Wow. And she had a big party at her home that evening.
Oh, wonderful.
I mean, it was really.
She was quite a philanthropist in Ottawa, and the women's clinic at the Ottawa General Hospital. Right. She supported a lot of organizations, well known. And I'm sorry that she's recently passed away.
Yes.
So I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to talk to her family.
Oh yeah. well, I would imagine.
Yeah.
You know, Martha, Phoebe, and
Yeah.
Dan, I've forgotten
Yeah,
this.
but it would be really nice to have,
Daniel.
family talk about their mother because she
Oh,
was
yeah.
quite
But that's why
forced.
this story,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
there's other stories. One other
So
story.
what happened at the Supreme Court?
So at the Supreme Court, we got leave to appeal, and I won the case, sort of. What the judge decided was that she was entitled to 1/4 of the assets, not 1/2. Why? Because she had only worked for half the marriage, and the other half she was staying home with her child until he was.
Yeah. So there's
So they
always
made
there.
it.
Yeah.
They related it to financial contribution instead of his contribution as wife and mother,
Right.
and I didn't like that. I mean, I did get some costs, by the way, but but I didn't like that.
So the
I
time
started
spent
alone.
with being mother, wife,
Nothing.
nothing.
And I didn't think that was right. So I thought, well, we're going to have to change the law. The Ontario Family Law Reform Act is not working. We have to change it to make it very, very clear. So I started a lobby group called the Justice Committee on Family Law Reform, and I got a nonpartisan group from, nonpartisan in terms of political parties, in terms of fields of endeavor. And so Florence Bird actually lent her name to the committee among the others. But, I mean, they lent their name to it in support, and then I ran with it.
Excellent. Excellent.
And so I was negotiating or trying to with Roy McMurtry as Attorney General, who had brought in an act that he thought was pretty good in 1978, and asking him, this was 1981, 81, to change it 3 years later. It's a credit to him that I found a way to persuade him.
Oh, good.
So in 1982, he says, well, we're looking at it, right? And the time went by. And I saw that the Women's Law Association was having a meeting, and he was the keynote speaker. So I said to the organizers, are you going to allow any questions? She said, well, we hadn't planned on it, but why not? So after his speech, I asked the question, when are you going to change Family Law Act so that women share property equally with husband and wife? And there's no question about it, or something in those terms. And he could have said, well, we're working on it. I mean, he stood there and he really, must have been a minute. He was thinking about it. And he finally said, we're going to do it. And he did.
Good on you. Good on you.
And in March of 1986, they brought in March 1, 1986. This was after he was out of office. By then, Ian Scott was the Attorney General, and he picked it up. Well, because I've been talking to McMurtry, but I've been talking to the other political parties too, because it's all about education, right?
Yeah.
To get them on board. So by the time they had an opportunity to finish pushing it through, they did.
Yeah.
So in March 1, 1986, we got the Family Law Act of Ontario, and it's still there. And based on the Law Reform Commission report, by the way. Based on the law reform.
I think I was taking, when I was at Carleton, I was taking law and psychology at an undergraduate level, and I remember reading the reports on the family law reform. I mean, I was reading those and thinking, well, this is interesting. Yeah, and then having to go through that kind of, separation of property later on in my life, I'm just going, yes, okay. But now those decisions that were made in the courts, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada, it might have been different had there been women on the courts, on the bench.
True. Although at the time, Bora Laskin was the Chief Justice, and he had put forward a dissent in another family law case a couple of years earlier that made me think he would be sympathetic. And for reasons, I just never understood why he wasn't. I really thought that we were lucky in who we got on our panel.
Bertha Wilson wasn't on the court at that time, was
No,
she?
no,
she wasn't.
No,
okay.
She wasn't on until I think the late 80s. Well, no, mid 80s, I think.
Yeah.
Because she was on when the Morgentaler decision came down, decriminalizing abortion in 1988.
Yeah.
So she was on the court at that time.
But not for you. Let's go and talk a little bit about Chatelaine. You wrote for Chatelaine for 25 years.
25 years.
As Ask a Lawyer.
Yes.
Were there themes? Were there trends? What jumped out at you? What kind of questions were they asking?
There were all kinds of questions. I also used it as a way, again, to educate women on what their legal rights were, because many didn't understand that they had any, right? And when a law was changed, I would do an article, I would do a piece on it, right, to describe it. I also used it in a I hoped it was a subtle way to get people to lobby on new issues. Now, for instance, child support was always paltry, and I felt that something had to be done about that. And there was a task force going across Canada at that time. I can't remember, Montreal MP was the leader of it. In any event, I did a piece on child support, what the laws were, what they should be, and so on, and said, and if you have an opinion on this, here's where to write. And when I went, I made a presentation to that task force as well on what should be done in the child support area. And after I finished, the staff came over to me and said, you know, if you hadn't, that article you wrote, we got so many letters on child support that it got it onto the political agenda.
Wow.
And I wouldn't have known if they hadn't told me. I simply wouldn't have known.
Wow. But now when they do separation of property or child maintenance, it's now quite tightly calculated.
Well, now
now that women work, there's more and more women working, so the whole equation changes.
The equation at that time was on the assumption that there were many women at home or working part-time, right? They were part of the traditional cohort of women. In a time that we are in now, if women are working equally with men, right, it can change the equation.
Absolutely, because women, from personal experience, I know that it absolutely changes the equation.
Right.
That there aren't the big awards. There aren't any. If you are an earner, when you split your children 50-50, you don't get anything, typically. If you have similar incomes.
Well, it depends if you're similar incomes.
If you have similar incomes and a similar lifestyle, and you're able to keep that up, the child maintenance is paltry or,
Well, it depends on whether you're working, whether you have the children more than 40% of the time.
Yeah.
So everybody struggles to make sure they have 41%.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily work that way anyway. So here's another question. By the late 1970s, there were a number of women's organizations that evolved, NAC, of course, and NAL, the National Association of Women in the Law. There was the Ontario Council on the Status of the Advisory Council. There was also the committee, as you mentioned. Women's shelters were created. How would you describe that era to young women today? Because it would have been just this hotbed of just the movement and that kind of excitement. And it would be sometimes hard to describe, but try to describe what it would be like for a young woman who doesn't know anything that period in history.
Well, it was a period, I think, where there were a lot of women who, as individuals, saw injustice and wanted to do something about it. And that's what impelled them into working together with other women in whatever ways could be found. But they had to start looking for colleagues, looking for people who also agreed, because everybody came from a different background, different ideas. It was exciting, yes. It was also very frustrating because there was a lot of resistance to change that would benefit women. You really had to talk people into it. And I've always said that period of our history was a time when there were people in power who were ready to listen. And I'm not so sure we have the same type of people in power today to the same extent. The fact that I was able to persuade Roy McMurtry to change the law, and it was quite an extreme change. It was a different structure, never mind. It wasn't just tweaking. And to change it, it changed 7 years after he'd already brought in a law that had been touted as wonderful, right? That's to the credit of the government, that government at the time. The problem has been when we make change, that the succeeding governments can take it away. And when you say, what do you want to tell young women? I don't want to tell them that it's a wonderful, exciting, engaging period to fight for women's rights. What I want to say is it's essential to fight for women's rights because nobody's going to give it to you. And even if you think you've got everything you need, you better keep your eyes open because it can be taken away. And it can be taken away like that. And can I give you some examples?
Absolutely.
So the Bob Rae government in Ontario brought in employment equity laws. Rosie Abella had been the chair of a special committee, the Honorable Rosie Abella. She defined employment equity and what had to be done. They brought in a law, and when Mike Harris came in 1985 for the Conservatives, he not only repealed the employment equity law that we thought we'd won, but he ordered the bureaucrats to shred every piece of paper that had been developed for it. Like, it didn't go to the archives. Shred every piece of paper. He wanted no record of it having ever existed. Okay? So, in 2004, I think, 2006, Paul Martin had persuaded, this is on the childcare issue now, he had persuaded every government across Canada to put money together for childcare places. Everybody was on board. The money was set aside federally, a couple of $1 billion. He lost to Harper minority government in about 2006. Within 2 weeks of taking office, Harper canceled the whole program. Period. So when I say to young women, you got to pay attention. You've got to watch out and who you're voting for and what you think they may plan to do and all that. I mean, here are two examples of we had advances and those advances were taken away. Look, pay equity laws came in the 80s. The public service fought Canada Post for years with delays and delays. They really gave them a hard time to get improvements for workers, for women, because they weren't being paid equally with men. It took 30 years before there was a decision because they'd managed to delay it all that time. And then they delayed further paying up. Ooh. So the fact is, you can get changes in the law, and they're essential because it gives the people who want to work with them tools. Yeah. Then you've got to make sure they use the tools.
Yeah.
And they use them in the way that they were intended.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that first Family Law Reform Act. It could have been interpreted for equality of property sharing. Could have been. But the judges didn't like the idea.
Wow. Okay. You worked with did you work with the Advisory Council, the Ontario Advisory Council?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
So that was so you would have thought if they were the Advisory Council to the government, that the government would have paid a lot of attention to it. You would have thought.
Yeah. No,
didn't happen.
It didn't. It was, we made reports, they tabled them. Right, they did that sort of thing. I remember Margaret Birch was our contact with the Interior Government, one of the first women
Yes.
MPPs. But did they really take our advice? Well, they listened, but did they learn? It's hard to say. We did some wonderful work. I was on the council from 1979 to 82. We did employment strategies for the 80s. We told them everything had to be done so that women could work fully as equals in the labor force, including childcare, including my pet thing that they should use the schools for daycare centers.
Of course. That would have been simple.
That's what I said.
I would have thought it would have been simple.
I was at a conference in 1984 where Betty Stevenson was there, and it was a partnership in Ontario Economic Conference when they opened the Metro Convention Centre, and they invited a variety of members, of people who represented various ideas and thinking, and I was the woman, I think, because that was, there weren't many others. Anyway, and we all had an opportunity in plenary session to ask a question, speak, or whatever. So Betty Stevenson was there, and she was the Minister of Education. So I asked her about using the schools. At that time, there was empty space in the schools. It's always cyclical. That's a parent's responsibility, daycare. So, that was 1984, and she was a woman.
Yeah.
It's a parent's responsibility, daycare.
Yes.
Listen, I had occasion to talk to her son many years later. I told him that story, and he said he talked to his mom about it, and she said, "Well, yeah, you live and learn."
Yeah, great. Yeah, live and learn on other people's backs. Yeah, It would have made things so much easier.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
Because when my daughter was small, there was no daycare. I found a small private school that did daycare. You could have a child there from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And so beforehand, during lunch, they had so-called daycare, but they were rare.
We were talking to Martha Friendly the other day about the childcare.
She did a lot of good work.
But the whole kind of movement and the, when I have taken a look and done some research on how women started co-ops at university, daycare co-ops. I mean, I found that fascinating. There was nothing. So if students had children, they would bring them into the university, and the parents would have to take turns taking care of the kids, and then they had to fight for funding. I mean, the whole daycare movement, childcare movement is quite extraordinary. We're only getting to it now. And it was mentioned 50 years ago in the report on this.
Oh yes, the Royal Commission report. And listen, they knew in wartime, during the Second World War, they provided daycare because they needed women in the workforce because the men were overseas.
Yeah.
So they found out how to do it.
Yeah.
And then the men came home and they closed them.
So I wanted to tell you, a lot of the work that you and others have described is a lot of activism in the Toronto area. Queen's Park is here. This is a, commercial center, lots of law things go on. So a lot of the women activists in the movements were in Toronto. But I know there were similar movements going on across the country in other capitals, provincial capitals. But in Ontario, and you mentioned Shirley Greenberg, did you involve other women in other cities? Were they connected at all to some of these issues? Did you, move forward with activists in other cities?
Well, we certainly tried to. Without, email today, email, social media, there's no geographic distance anymore, or you can avoid that. But no, for instance, I remember a conference we had on the Constitution. We got room at City Hall in Toronto, but people came in. I met Lynn Smith from BC. I met some, there were people, Sheila Martin was part of that constitutional conference. She's now on the Supreme Court of Canada. So the constitutional issues itself, I remember that people came in from across the country. And National Action Committee on the Status of Women was definitely across Canada. They had organizations. They were mostly organizations that formed part of NAC, and they were some national, some local, some like that. But
the law reform work that you were doing, it seems that it was a preponderance of Toronto women. I want to know if there was other women involved from other parts of Ontario.
Oh, from other parts of Ontario. Ah, not so much.
That's interesting. I find that living in Ottawa, I find that really interesting.
Because I mean, I think it was less us looking for them as if they wanted to participate. We tried to find a way to include them. I just can't. I can't remember who might fit that bill from outside Ontario, from outside Toronto.
But I do know the women in Ottawa would have been really a lot more focused on federal government.
Yeah, but
just
Oakville,
because
that's the Toronto area. Do you know what I mean? I mean, remember lawyers in Oakville, but and Oshawa and Ottawa for sure. Ottawa was part of the Toronto mix. I mean, there were Ottawa people involved.
Yeah. You've written, so you've written several books. We've talked about the Canadian, the women in Canadian life. You've also written Every Canadian's Guide to the Law, and you've done one on women. So this is from birth to...
That's from birth. Well, it's from before birth to after death. In other words, from fetal rights to settling an estate. And there's a lot of women's issues in here too, because I think that everybody should know all of these things, right? So it started as Everyone's Guide to the Law, and this is the 4th edition, which is Every Canadian's Guide to the Law. Yeah.
So you have to keep updating it because things keep changing. Your next project. And then lastly, and I want to talk about this, you've written more about your life and your life's work in Fairly Equal. How did this come about? Lawyering the Feminist Revolution.
Well, I was thinking about the young people and how if they don't know what happened in the second wave women's movement and how we did what we did and what to worry about and what to watch out for, who's going to tell them if we who lived through it don't tell them? And there wasn't much written. I mean, I'm not aware that there's nothing. This is from a legal perspective, after all. This is all the legal issues that affect women, which are, considerable. And it's a social history of the women's movement as well as a personal memoir, because you have to put yourself in a context when you're dealing with things. But I really felt there needed to be a record. And, many women didn't keep, I had my own law office, so I could put files, put it in the spare room, And when eventually I retired from the practice, I hired somebody to help me go through all this stuff, some of it, and scan some of it. So I have a lot of the historical information scanned.
What are you doing with it?
Well, I have put all the original papers, not all yet, I haven't finished the job, but the first group have gone to the Archives of Ontario.
Okay.
In 2018. And now I've got, photographs and tapes and that kind of thing that are going to be going, because I don't want these things to be lost.
I do some work with the Feminist Archives at the University of Ottawa.
Yeah, they're hard to reach, actually. I'm glad to know that.
We're going to be doing some work and some more partnering with them. And I'm expecting that the head librarian will join our board.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
That's very important. Yeah. So I kept so much. I remember any number of women saying to me, I wouldn't know how to write anything if I don't remember it, because I didn't. What made you keep papers, right?
So that's another thing we have to tell young people, is to keep the papers.
Yes, you have to keep the
files.
record. If you're making history, it isn't made unless it's written down. I was a history major. I know that on reflection, years later, I realized there was no women's history ever taught. I learned the history going back to the dawn of reported time and everywhere in between, but nothing about women's history.
I took a women's history course. By the time
you were later, I guess.
I was a little bit later, and I went back as an adult. I had children. I was working, but I went and took some courses at night for fun.
Yeah.
And I took
Well, things
women's
changed.
I took women's history, and of course, yes, there's gender studies, so a lot of it happens in gender studies. So there,
Right.
but that's still also fairly recent.
Right. But at that time, when I took my history course, and there was no woman prof, no woman history professor in the whole department. And I didn't think anything of it because that's what life was then.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. Generations. What is, in your opinion, what is an example of one or the two of the legal reforms or change in Canadian history that has really altered significantly the course of equality?
I think I would have to start with the decriminalization of abortion. Because until women have the right to control their own bodies, they can't control anything else. I mean, if you're having a dozen children, tell me how you're going to go take a job in the workforce. If you don't want a dozen children, you should be able to choose, right? So I think I have to start there. And until 1967, around there, abortion was a criminal offense, period. And anybody who facilitated it was guilty of a crime. That was the end of that. It was under the Pierre Trudeau government that they brought in the rule that a committee of doctors in a hospital could do it if the woman's life and health were at risk. And fortunately, some very liberal Canadian doctors treated liberally the concept of women's life and health. But it was the Morgentaler with the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League, Norma Scarborough, all the people who were involved in that, who eventually led to, in 1988, the decriminalization of abortion. And I think that's put women in a position where they can be in control of their own bodies, their own lives. So that is an important issue, number one. Number two, because women had control over their own bodies, they also have more control over being able to work or not work, and therefore being able to be independent or not. And so independence and pay equity is the next thing. Now, the history of pay equity is in 1951, they passed an equal pay law. But because it had to be a comparison between men and women doing exactly the same work, it didn't work. Because men and women didn't do exactly the same work at that time. So there were various changes over the years, equal pay for work of equal value, equal pay for substantially the same work. Then pay equity came along, and there's laws in place. Now, those have all been wonderful advances, but that's still work still to be done. So I mentioned abortion. That there isn't work to be done, but there's vigilance to be, and that was just very important on that. On pay equity, there's still work to be done because women are still 68 cents on every dollar a man earns in 2024, right? The other thing that's been an advance, I say, is the family law issues, the sharing of property, the equality between men and women in marriage, the substantial increase in spousal support, the substantial increase in child support, so that it puts women in a better position to be able to be independent, right? If they don't just leave a marriage with nothing.
Yeah.
Part of all that, by the way, going back to the family law, when I was on the Status of Women Council, I had a client come into my office, talk to me about the fact that she was married 30 years, no children. She stayed at home. Her husband made a will naming his brother his sole heir. She wasn't going to get anything. She asked me, what could we do, right? And I'm looking through the law, and I realized this, apart from some small amount of support she might get under the succession laws. So I took it to the Ontario Council and the Status of Women. That's called the clients feeding the activism. And we did a brief on it to the government. And eventually, when they brought in the Family Law Act 1986, that hole was plugged so that widows are entitled to the same basic thing as divorced women, Because I said to him at the time, why should you have to be divorced in order to get the benefit of half?
Yeah.
If you stay through to the bitter end, right?
Why didn't she get it all?
Oh, well,
I would say, yeah, that's what I would have said.
Well,
Oh,
that's
mean husband.
Ooh. So I've talked about abortion and pay equity and family law as being great advances. Violence against women is an advance over what was, but there's so much more to do. So much more to do. And I think we need a national women's movement. Again, I think we need a national action committee on the status of women, or whatever you want to call it. We need some group that represents everyone to come forward and speak for one voice.
I actually, over the past week, and I've been talking to several of, your cohort, and, other women activists, and I've been thinking the same thing, and I'm going, well, why don't we have that now again? Like, because communication would be so much easier, because we understand inclusivity and diversity, the intersectionality. Why aren't we lobbying for these as a big, huge movement? Why, why aren't, actually, I was thinking about that yesterday. I'm thinking, is that a dumb question to ask?
I
Because
find a lot of resistance among those even who, you should ask some of the people you're interviewing about that, because I find resistance among some of the women who lived through the NAC era, and also people who are part of small groups, you would call intersectional groups, that don't want to join in a wider movement. They feel their issues are different, and yet I guess I feel that equality and fairness affects everybody.
But it's not just that the issues are very different and specialized. Agreed. But it's the same kind of principles for research, for policy making or policy discussions, and for the tactics in order to lobby. Those all remain the same.
Yes.
Whether you're doing it for the environment, or you're doing it on daycare, or you're doing it on violence against women, or gender-based violence. So it's all of those factors are the same. The subjects are different. So why wouldn't you come together and have greater discussion and build a greater...
That's been my feeling.
I would have thought that would made sense. And, there's sometimes going back isn't such a bad thing.
Call it something else.
Yeah.
Structure it differently. I mean, but
talking to you all has made me go...
We need to speak with one voice, because then governments are more likely to listen. After all, isn't one of the tactics that governments have divide and conquer, right? If we're divided, they don't necessarily have to listen in the same way. So, well, talk to each other and tell us what you want.
Yeah. I have a view of the world in politics, which is probably a little bit more establishment and,
Well, it's different. You're from the inside.
I'm from the inside.
Yeah.
So I think they would receive, a lot of input. I think they need it.
And they need it in the right form.
And they need it in the right form. It makes me want to get more active, which I know my managers would hate me to say that. Anyway, but we do have to be vigilant on the abortion front. Look what's happening in the United States. So, oh my God.
Could anyone have imagined?
No.
I couldn't.
No. And they can take rights away. There are lots of things that they can do. So you've got to be vigilant.
That's why we need a national organization with people whose sole job is to keep an eye out and act accordingly. Because right now it's being left to volunteers.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because the current government, of course, puts a lot of money into capacity building for women's organizations and women's programs.
Yeah,
that's
true.
That they do a lot of work with it.
I may not be familiar with it. I'm not.
But it was a department I worked in, so I understand. They put lots and lots of money into a lot of programming, capacity building, but also programs to help shelters or to help on various causes. But that can easily be taken away. That's not legislation. That's a government's choice. So another government may choose differently. And at one time it was about women's equality, but now it's not just women's equality. It's about diversity and gender inclusivity. So it includes, it includes young people. It will include the LGBTQ community. It will include,
Right.
so it's more inclusive, but that is a government choice and that can easily be taken away.
Right. Right.
And then we go back to a few
Yeah.
dark ages where you have to rely on volunteers. And at some point, you don't necessarily want to only rely on volunteers because why shouldn't women get paid
Yeah.
for? We have this debate in
Yeah.
our own organization. You have to pay people to do the work. They need the income too. So you are relying on volunteers less and less and less, and you need to be able to pay women what they deserve to be paid.
Yeah.
So that's a
But when I read the papers, and I think, there would have been a time when the head of NAC, there would have been an article saying, this is how we see this issue, for example. Where there are such articles now, if I write something, I'm writing as an individual, right? And
yeah.
and they may listen, they may not listen. It depends, right? But
also the way we've communicated is different because you don't have a Globe and Mail advert, because
No.
They used to have advertising in
That's
the Globe
true.
and Mail, which went across the country, and it was all about this issue or that issue, and can't get that now. The Toronto Star, you don't. So it's changed so much.
Yes, it has, and the patterns of who you speak to and how
Yeah.
it's a toss up. Whether every time I do write to the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and members of the cabinet when I have an idea that I think they should pursue, and my hope is always that they'll think, "Oh, this is great." Yes.
But you need to have your little chain letter. Remember when we used to do chain letters?
Yes.
We should do chain letters and just
Well,
talk to other people who can say the same thing to the same people.
Yes, so that's a new approach.
A new approach. No, taking an old approach and just sort of like
the National Chain Letter for Women organization.
We could do that. I want to ask you because we're just going to wrap up now. But this has been really interesting, and I really wanted to learn more about the law aspects of history of women. So this has been really, really helpful. Would you do it all over again?
Oh, yeah.
And what have you learned? How would you change? What would you do differently? I always want to end on something like, how would you do it differently, or what would you tell young women? You've already discussed that.
Well, I've spoken about that. I can't say that there's anything I would have done differently because mostly you have to respond to the events that exist then. You're initiating, but you're also responding. So for instance, when Roy McMurtry, when that government was on its way out, Bill Davis resigned. Four people were up for leader, Roy being one of them, and didn't get it. I then had to work, so I had to turn on a dime, and I had to talk to the other four that were looking for it to see if I could get them on board, right? And went from there. But it's you have to adapt and change to what's going on. And I can't think of what in particular I would have done differently. I would have loved to bring more and more and more younger women forward over those years so that they would be the leaders today.
Some of them are. Some of them
I know some of them are.
Some of them are. Some of them did it organically or they did it intuitively, whatever.
Right.
I would have used my voice differently. I would have had a voice. I didn't have a voice when I was younger. I didn't have a voice until I was perhaps in my early 30s.
Okay.
I would have been much more of a rabble rouser than
Rabble rouser, yeah. Well,
I think I would have
that's
liked
what I was, but
I would have loved that.
yeah. And the fact is that I did it in all kinds of ways. I did speaking engagements. I mean, when I spoke, on family law, for example, I circulated a petition, and at one point I deposited 2,300 petitions in the floor of the legislature, or had somebody do it. They wouldn't let me do it, to say that these people all want change, right? Right? So, but also I had a forum as Chatelaine.
Yes.
25 years. I mean, I had a forum for sure. And I did other op-ed pieces for the newspapers or or letters to the editor. I mean, if it was a short thing and I wanted to get, but in those days they had much more space for all that stuff. Journalism isn't what it was. But I found all the ways in which I could get my voice heard, including in the courts, including
It's nice. That's nice.
And no, I can't. If you would say to me, maybe you should have done this, then I could answer you, oh, okay, maybe I should have. But frankly, I did everything that I felt I could do at the time, and I'm happy with it.
Let's leave it there. Thank
Okay.
you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
I
Thank
did.
you.
Thank you.
you.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.